Richard Callahan believed he had done the hardest thing a man could ever do. He believed he had finally set himself free. Sitting across from his lawyer, signing the last page of the divorce papers, he felt nothing but relief. His wife, Eleanor, sat in her wheelchair by the window, watching him in silence, saying nothing, asking for nothing. He didn't look at her, not once. He told himself this was survival, that he deserved a life without the weight she had become. He had no idea, none at all, that in signing his name that afternoon, he had signed away the one thing that could have saved everything he was about to lose. He thought he was walking away a free man. In reality, he was walking straight into the darkest chapter of his life, and he would not understand what he had done until it was far too late to undo it. 3 years later, Richard sat in a different office, across from a different lawyer, this time not signing anything, but staring at a single piece of paper that made his hands tremble. Down the hall, behind a locked door, sat a safe he had never been allowed to open. He would remember, in that moment, the sound of Eleanor's wheelchair rolling softly across the kitchen floor the night he told her she was a burden. He would remember her silence, and he would understand, finally, that her silence had never meant surrender. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 years earlier, none of this had happened yet. Richard Callahan was simply a tired man in a small house outside Dayton, Ohio, convinced that his life had quietly become someone else's problem to fix. To understand how a man could look at the woman who once saved his life and see only a burden, you have to understand what came before. And to understand what came after, you have to ask 2 questions that will follow us through every part of this story. What exactly did Eleanor Callahan own that her husband needed so badly? And did she know, long before he did, exactly what was coming? Richard never asked himself those questions. Not once in 3 years. He assumed he understood his wife completely, the way men sometimes assume they understand the people who love them quietly and without complaint. He was wrong. And the cost of being wrong would follow him for the rest of his life. Before any of this, before the wheelchair, before the silence, before the papers, there was a much simpler story. Richard Callahan grew up the son of a machinist in a small Ohio town where nobody expected much and nobody asked for much either. He met Eleanor Whitfield at 23, at a diner where she worked the evening shift to help pay her father's medical bills. She was sharp-witted, quick to laugh, and impossible to ignore. Richard, by his own admission to friends years later, had never felt like he deserved her. She had a way of making ordinary evenings feel important. She remembered small details about people, birthdays, favorite songs, the names of coworkers' children. People trusted her instinctively. Richard built his early confidence on the fact that a woman like that had chosen him. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony behind her father's house. Eleanor's father, a quiet, methodical man named Walter Whitfield, had spent 30 years building a modest but respected furniture restoration business out of a converted barn. It was never glamorous work, but it was steady, and Walter was known throughout 3 counties for the quality of his craftsmanship. He treated Eleanor as his only true successor, teaching her the business from the time she could hold a sanding block. Richard, for his part, worked in logistics for a regional shipping company. Steady but unremarkable work that paid the bills without ever making him feel like more than a name on a payroll list. For the first several years of their marriage, life moved forward without much drama. They bought a small house. They talked eventually about children, though it never quite happened, and neither of them spoke about it much afterward. Eleanor split her time between substitute teaching and helping her aging father in the workshop. Richard climbed, slowly, through the ranks of his company, though never quite as fast as he believed he deserved. Friends who knew them back then describe a marriage that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. Comfortable, unremarkable, the kind of marriage nobody worries about. What none of them knew was that Walter Whitfield had already begun making quiet decisions about the future of his business. Decisions that would matter more than anyone could have predicted, years before the accident that would change everything. The accident happened on a wet October evening, on a stretch of county road Eleanor had driven 1,000 times before. She was returning from her father's workshop, where she had spent the afternoon finishing a restoration project for a client in Columbus. According to the police report, a delivery truck failed to stop at a poorly lit intersection and struck the driver's side of her car. Eleanor survived. The driver of the truck did not. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital. The injury to her spine was severe enough that doctors told her, gently but plainly, that she would not walk again. Richard was at her bedside every day for those 6 weeks, and by every account from nurses and family who were there, he seemed devoted, frightened, and determined to help her recover. Friends who visited during that period remember him holding her hand for hours, reading to her, promising her that nothing between them would change. For a while, it seemed like that promise might hold. Eleanor came home to a house Richard had modified as best he could on short notice. Ramps built hastily in the garage, furniture rearranged, a first-floor bedroom improvised from what used to be a home office. She was determined, from the very beginning, not to let the accident define her. Within months, she had returned to managing paperwork for her father's business from home, using her hands the same way she always had, precise and unhurried. Walter visited constantly, more protective of his daughter now than ever, and it was during this period, family members later recalled, that Walter began speaking privately with his lawyer about restructuring the ownership of the business. Nobody thought much of it at the time. It seemed like the natural caution of an aging father worried about his daughter's future. Nobody, including Richard, imagined it would matter. The change in Richard did not happen overnight. It happened the way most quiet failures happen, in small increments that are easy to excuse individually and impossible to excuse once you add them all together. The first year after the accident, colleagues at Richard's company noticed he seemed distracted, exhausted, occasionally irritable in ways that were unlike him. He began turning down invitations from friends, citing responsibilities at home. He stopped attending the company's Friday gatherings entirely. Co-workers who knew him well later described a man who seemed to be disappearing into resentment without fully realizing it himself. At home, the strain showed itself differently. Eleanor required help with tasks she once handled without a second thought: dressing, bathing, moving between rooms before the ramps were finished. Richard handled these responsibilities, but with a growing weariness that Eleanor noticed long before he ever said a word about it. She later told her sister that she could feel the shift in him, not in his actions, which remained dutiful, but in his silences, which grew longer and heavier by the month. By the second year, Richard had begun spending more evenings at a bar near his office, telling Eleanor he was working late. It was during this period that he became closer to a coworker named Danielle Sorrento, a relationship that started, by his own later account, as nothing more than friendly conversation over drinks after difficult days. Friends who knew both of them insist nothing crossed a clear line for a long time. But emotional distance has a way of becoming physical distance, and physical distance has a way of becoming something else entirely, given enough time and enough excuses. Eleanor never confronted him directly during this period. She has said, in later conversations with family, that she chose to watch rather than accuse, believing that a man who truly loved her would find his way back on his own. She was patient in a way that many people who knew her considered remarkable. Others, looking back, wonder if her patience was something else entirely, a quiet, deliberate decision to let Richard reveal exactly who he was before she decided what to do about it. Richard, several drinks into the evening, laughed in a way witnesses later described as uncomfortable rather than genuine. He said, in front of the table, that some days he felt like his entire life was built around managing one long, unmovable burden, and that he sometimes wondered what it would be like to simply live for himself again. He did not look at Eleanor as he said it. He did not need to. The table went quiet. Eleanor, according to 2 people who were seated near her, said nothing at all. She simply looked at him for a long moment, then quietly asked one of the other guests to help wheel her toward the door. She did not cry in front of anyone that night. She did not raise her voice. She went home alone in a car arranged by a friend, and Richard did not return until well after midnight. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that Eleanor had spent that entire drive home making a decision she had been circling for months. A decision she would not share with him for a long time to come. 2 months after that dinner, Eleanor asked Richard, calmly and without warning, for a divorce. Richard, by his own later admission to a close friend, felt an immediate and overwhelming sense of relief, followed almost instantly by guilt for feeling that relief at all. He did not fight the decision. He did not ask her to reconsider. He agreed almost immediately, and the process moved forward with a speed that surprised everyone who knew them. Eleanor's requests during the divorce proceedings were, by every account, remarkably modest. She asked for very little of the shared property. She did not contest the house. She did not pursue significant financial support, despite having every legal right to request it given her medical needs. Richard's lawyer, reviewing the terms years later, would describe the settlement as unusually one-sided in Richard's favor. At the time, Richard interpreted this as confirmation that Eleanor simply wanted to move on quickly, without conflict. It did not occur to him to wonder why a woman with every legal advantage would walk away asking for almost nothing. The day the papers were finalized, Richard signed his name, thanked his lawyer, and walked out of the office feeling, for the first time in years, like a man who had regained control of his own life. Eleanor signed hers quietly, without comment, and was wheeled out by her sister without a single word to Richard as she passed him in the hallway. He would not see her again for nearly a year. He would not think about her often during that time either, at least not consciously. He believed entirely that the story between them was over. He had no way of knowing that Walter Whitfield had finalized the restructuring of his business less than 3 weeks before the divorce was filed, transferring full and irrevocable ownership to Eleanor alone, with specific legal language excluding any future or former spouse from any claim to the company, its assets, its contracts, or a particular piece of property tied to it that Richard would come to need more than almost anything else in his life. For the better part of a year, Richard's life seemed to unfold exactly the way he had imagined it would. He moved into a modern apartment closer to the city. His relationship with Danielle became public and, for a while, seemed to bring him a kind of lightness he had not felt in years. He was promoted again within his company, this time to a regional director position that came with a substantial increase in salary and a level of professional respect he had long felt was overdue. Friends who spent time with him during this period describe a man who seemed lighter, more talkative, more like the version of himself they remembered from years earlier. He rarely spoke about Eleanor. When her name did come up, he would describe the divorce as the hardest but most necessary decision of his life, framing it as an act of self-preservation rather than abandonment. He told himself and others that Eleanor was better off as well, free to build a life without the weight of his frustration and fatigue. What Richard did not know, during this period of apparent success, was that his company's regional division was quietly entering into a series of new contracts with local suppliers, one of which involved a specialized furniture restoration and custom fabrication business known for its rare access to a specific type of reclaimed hardwood material used in a high-value contract Richard's own division was depending on to secure funding for its continued expansion. He did not yet know the name of the business. He would not know it for several more months. When he finally did, the ground beneath his new life would begin to shift in ways he never saw coming. The discovery came, as these things often do, through an unremarkable meeting that Richard nearly skipped entirely. His division was finalizing a major contract that depended on a rare supply partnership, one that had taken nearly a year to secure and represented the centerpiece of the expansion Richard had been personally overseeing. During a routine review of supplier documentation, Richard noticed a name on the ownership records that made him stop entirely mid-sentence in front of his own colleagues. Whitfield Restoration and Fine Woodworking, the company now supplying the exact material his entire contract depended on, was listed under a single owner, Eleanor Callahan. Not Eleanor Whitfield. Eleanor Callahan, her married name retained even after the divorce, a detail she had never explained to anyone, and one that would only make sense to Richard much later. He assumed, at first, it had to be a coincidence, a different Eleanor entirely. It took him less than an hour of quiet, increasingly frantic research to confirm that it was not a coincidence at all. Richard sat alone in his office that evening long after his colleagues had gone home, staring at documents that confirmed something he could barely process. The material his entire contract, his promotion, his professional reputation now depended on, came from a business solely and irrevocably owned by the woman he had once called a burden in front of an entire table of coworkers. The woman he had signed away without a second thought. The woman whose silence he had mistaken, for 3 years, as defeat. Richard did not sleep well for several nights after the discovery. He told himself, at first, that the situation was manageable, that business was business, and that Eleanor, whatever she thought of him personally, would not risk her own company's reputation by allowing a professional disagreement to affect a legitimate contract. He decided, against the advice of a colleague who sensed something was wrong, to reach out to her directly rather than through formal channels. Richard hung up the phone that evening with a feeling he had not expected. Not anger, not indignation, something closer to fear. He was beginning to understand, for the first time, that the woman he had dismissed as helpless 3 years earlier had built something entirely her own, something he now depended on completely, and something she had no obligation whatsoever to protect for his benefit. In the weeks that followed, Richard found himself doing something he had never done before. He began investigating his own past decisions with the same scrutiny he might apply to a stranger. He requested copies of the original divorce settlement from his lawyer, searching for any clause that might grant him leverage. He found none. The settlement, drafted with unusual precision, excluded him from any claim to Eleanor's business interests, present or future, in language so specific that his lawyer admitted he had rarely seen anything so carefully constructed in a case that had appeared, on its surface, so amicable. Richard began asking mutual friends what they remembered from those final months of the marriage, searching for any sign he might have missed. Slowly, uncomfortably, a picture began to emerge that he had never allowed himself to see clearly before. Eleanor's calm during the divorce had not been resignation. Her modest requests had not been generosity. They had been the actions of a woman who already understood, long before Richard did, that she held something valuable, and that the surest way to protect it was to ask for nothing that might invite scrutiny or negotiation. Richard began to understand that Walter Whitfield's restructuring of the business, finalized so quietly in the weeks before the divorce, had not been the routine caution of an aging father. It had been a deliberate, protective maneuver, executed with Eleanor's full knowledge, designed to ensure that whatever happened between her and Richard, the one thing she had left, her father's legacy and her own resilience, would remain entirely and permanently hers. As weeks turned into months, the pressure on Richard's professional life intensified. His division's leadership grew increasingly anxious about the stability of the supply contract, unaware of the personal history entangled within it. Richard found himself in the impossible position of defending a business relationship he could not fully explain to his superiors without revealing the deeply personal complications behind it. He grew evasive in meetings. His colleagues, who had once admired his composure, began to notice cracks in his usual confidence. Danielle, his partner during this period, sensed the shift in him long before he ever explained its cause. When he finally told her the truth, that the supplier his career now depended on was owned by his ex-wife, her reaction was not the sympathy he had hoped for. She grew distant almost immediately, uncomfortable with the tangled history now threatening the stability of his career, and by extension, their relationship. Friends who observed the two of them during this period describe a relationship that cooled rapidly, weighed down by a complication neither of them had ever anticipated. Richard began to feel, for the first time since the divorce, a sensation he had spent years avoiding entirely. Powerlessness. The same powerlessness Eleanor must have felt, sitting silently in her wheelchair while he complained about the burden of caring for her. He did not make that connection consciously, not yet. But those close to him during this period noticed a change in the way he spoke. Quieter, more careful, less certain of his own righteousness than he had been in years. Eventually, Richard requested a formal meeting with Eleanor, insisting it take place in person rather than over the phone. Eleanor agreed, though she chose the location herself, her father's old workshop, now expanded into a proper facility employing nearly a dozen skilled craftspeople. Richard arrived expecting, on some level, to find the same fragile woman he remembered from the day of the divorce. Instead, he found a confident, composed business owner walking him through a facility she had built into something far larger and more respected than her father's original operation had ever been. Eleanor listened patiently as Richard explained the pressure his division was under, the importance of the contract, the professional consequences he faced if the material supply was disrupted. She did not raise her voice. She did not mention the dinner where he had called her a burden in front of his colleagues. She simply asked him, calmly, why he believed she owed him any consideration at all, given everything that had happened between them. Richard, by his own later account, had no good answer. He apologized, haltingly, for the first time since the divorce, not as a strategic move but because in that moment, standing in the workshop her father had built and she had expanded despite every obstacle placed in front of her, he finally understood the full weight of what he had thrown away. Eleanor listened to his apology without visible reaction. She told him she would consider the contract on its merits alone, and that his apology, whatever its sincerity, would have no bearing on that decision. Eleanor's final decision came 2 weeks later, delivered through her company's legal representative, rather than through any personal conversation with Richard. She agreed to honor the existing contract terms, citing her company's professional obligations and the reputation she had worked to build. A reputation she was unwilling to compromise regardless of her personal feelings toward the division's regional director. She added one condition. Richard would no longer be permitted to serve as the primary point of contact for the account. All future business would be conducted through another member of his team. Richard's career survived, though not in the way he had once imagined it would. He kept his position, but the promotion he had been quietly hoping for beyond his current role never materialized. His relationship with Danielle ended quietly within the year, the strain of the previous months having worn away whatever had once drawn them together. He moved into a smaller apartment, spent considerably more time alone than he had in years, and began, for the first time since the accident that changed Eleanor's life, to genuinely reflect on the man he had become during those difficult years of their marriage. Eleanor's business continued to grow. Whitfield Restoration and Fine Woodworking became known throughout the region for the quality and rarity of its materials, employing craftspeople who spoke of Eleanor with a level of respect that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with admiration for what she had built from a converted barn and a father's quiet foresight. There was no dramatic courtroom confrontation in this story. No verdict read aloud to a stunned gallery. No single moment where everyone gasped at once. The justice in this story, if it can be called that, arrived slowly, quietly, the way most real consequences do. Richard did not lose everything. He kept his job, his health, his freedom. But he lost the version of himself he had once been so certain he deserved. The version who believed strength meant walking away from difficulty rather than staying to face it. Eleanor, for her part, never sought public vindication. She never told the story to reporters, never used it to embarrass Richard professionally, never leveraged her position for anything beyond the survival and growth of a business her father had built with his own hands. Those close to her say she rarely spoke about Richard at all in the years that followed, not out of unresolved anger, but because she had genuinely moved past him, in a way he had never quite managed to move past her. So we return to the two questions that opened this story. What did Eleanor Callahan own that Richard needed? Not simply a business, not simply a contract, but something far more difficult for a man like Richard to admit he lacked. Resilience, foresight, the quiet strength to endure being underestimated by the person who was supposed to protect her, and to build something enduring anyway, without ever needing his help to do it. And did she know what was coming? Perhaps not in every detail, but she understood, long before Richard did, that a person's worth is never determined by the person who dismisses them. It is determined by what they choose to build in spite of that dismissal. If the story moved you, let us know in the comments what stayed with you the most. Do you think Richard ever truly understood what he lost? Or do you think some lessons only look clear from a distance? And if you found yourself holding your breath through this one, wait until you hear what happened in our next story. A case just as quiet and just as unforgettable. Don't forget to subscribe.